Welcome. We'll just get you guys to do a brief introduction and then we'll go into questions. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Darren Fiddler and Lorraine Johns from the Strategic Transport team. So you've all got a copy of the draft policy and a cover paper, so I'll just cover a few points here. So in development of the draft policy, we've engaged with a wide number of stakeholders, from residents groups to businesses, community groups, and government partners. The policy itself outlines the issues, goals, and a series of parking policies to meet those goals. The goals are focused around optimising occupancy, supporting our emissions reductions targets, provision of high amenity off-street parking, providing a vibrant central city, and improving our data and information. The scope of the policy is for on-street parking, council-owned off-street parking, and we also have a policy in there around temporary surface parking lots. The policies themselves provide a clear signal on how council wishes to prioritise the use of valuable central city land to enable a transparent, consistent decision-making process with any changes to parking provision in the central city.
Thank you very much. And I guess a key thing to highlight on this before we go into questions, obviously this is a proposed parking policy that will go out for consultation. So I was on the hearings panel for the suburban parking policy, and actually through there we did do a number of changes, which was good to see. But is there any questions on this? Tim?
Yeah, thank you. Just I totally understand this is just going out for, it covers just the central city parking, and it's going out, this is really just to approve it going out for a hearing and to come back with recommendations. Just on 6.2, so, the proposed goals of the draft parking policy are to support greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So the only way technically you can do that is reduce vehicles. So I'm presuming, or encourage electric vehicles or something. So is this policy in some way just trying to reduce the use of petrol or diesel cars in that some way?
So a major focus of this is recognising that a large number of the costs of driving at the moment are externalised, so subsidised, whether that's by private businesses, councils, or just imposed on other users of the transport system. So part of this is incorporating the genuine cost, particularly with regards to off-street parking. It's enabling the market to do its thing. So if people still choose to drive and pay the full cost of it, there's still that free choice. But it's incorporating that cost into the system rather than at the moment it's externalised.
Aaron?
Yeah, so just with forming our parking policy going forward, and I note that it's framed around where we've come from really in the last 10 years, and I note in there has that we're currently, our inner city employment numbers and people living are only 3/4 of what they were pre-quake, and normally when you build shiny and new you attract more people, not less. So this forms part of that whole picture. So there was a couple of questions I had. One is with and it says here about the number of off-street high quality car parks that have been built, parking buildings, which is correct. But do we know the Christchurch public appetite for that? Certainly I've had feedback from people who don't like parking buildings. They have an almost an irrational fear of them. So their preference would be to not be in a parking building versus a parking building. So is that a consideration in the paper for a start?
Certainly all people's considerations and preferences, that I guess the policies are focused around the cost of that choice. So there is with having surface parking lots, obviously they take up a lot of space. They are lower amenity, which pushes goods and services further and further apart. So yeah, there's always a trade-off. We could have, as malls do, hectares and hectares of parking, which isn't a particularly pleasant environment to be in. The central city is very different from a mall with regards to the 35,000 employees and growing, the growing number of residents that are coming into the central city as well. It's providing that high amenity environment for them. And that's not very possible or it's very, very difficult if you have hectares and hectares of surface parking. So there's a trade-off there.
Right. Certainly the malls anecdotally look successful, but maybe they're not. And then 3.2.5, we do not have the capacity with current tools to enforce all on-street parking restrictions. What does that mean?
Well, essentially, we've got, is it 5,000 parks with parking restrictions at the moment? Something like that, on-street parks. We've got a lot of parking restrictions throughout the city.
Did you say 5,000 restrictions?
So how many restricted parks there are?
Oh, right,
Yeah.
okay.
I think we've got the data on that in our parking policy. But essentially, our enforcement team looks to monitor all car parks, but they couldn't, for example, monitor every single car park at the same time. So the resources have to be spread. So the point there is that you basically have to target your monitoring.
So, for example, if...
To where problems are?
Sorry?
We'd go to where the problems are, that would be our hierarchy.
So once someone has someone has overstayed, like a parking officer needs to go back for a P120 after 2 hours, and you get a ticket for overstaying for 2 hours. If a parking officer doesn't go back again an hour later, that ticket would just be for 2 hours. So there's just, in order to establish how much you're overstaying, you need parking officers going around every hour or far more frequently. So we just don't have the resource to do that.
Right, is that not self-funding? If there's lots of people breaching, then it pays for itself?
I guess the ideal situation is that it's not self-funding because we want the enforcement to encourage good behaviour. So as a starting point, it might be self-funding, but the whole point of enforcement is that we want to encourage good behaviour, which means, ironically, we lose the revenue as people start doing what we want them to do.
And that helps us to make sure that the parking policy, the goal of 85% occupancy at peak times, if we're enforcing properly and people behaving the way we need them to, that means that you should always be able to find a park. But we have, so our parks are well used, but you can always find a park when you need one. The problem if you didn't have enforcement is essentially people will overstay and then you can't find a park. So it's just because we have limited resources, the team has to every day target where they're monitoring.
Okay, and then the final question, just to balance that up. What does the opposite look like? Like at the moment, we have all that you've just explained, but are not a very successful inner city. So, because we're trying to get people to do what we want them to do, what does it look like when we do what they want to do? Have we considered that?
So with regards to...
That's what a shopping mall does. It kind of goes, people want to be able to all park here and it be really simple, and then I go and get my goods, and they falsely think that they're not walking far. They do. You walk a lot of distance once you're in the mall, but it's people think they've got close, whereas in the inner city, they think the opposite. But
So with regards to not being a very successful central city, we know that occupancy rates are down, we know employees are coming back, we know that consents are coming in for residential dwellings in the central city. So everything we're doing appears to be working.
Right, okay. Okay, I just was going by we're only at 3/4 of what we were at pre-quake when we were being told back then the central city was dying. So that was all. It's just based on that number.
Thanks, Aaron. Leanne?
I've raised this before, which is, as an inner city dweller myself, the parking policy identifies residents parking as an issue. It's not for me. The place where I have an apartment has off-street parking, so that's not the issue. But I do have visitors who can't access that off-street parking. Without me giving access to it, and it is an issue for inner city dwellers in terms of getting work people in. So I had someone in for my oven this morning, and there was a clash with the timing of someone coming in to do work on the building. So the one park that is available off street for that person was a double up. And people who live in the central city have friends who come and visit, maybe not me, but others do. And but so And in this policy, it just doesn't identify anything other than residents off-street parking. So it doesn't acknowledge that residents have lives that are beyond, you know, they're the same as lives people live in the suburbs, but there aren't the same restrictions applying there. So I kind of did want it acknowledged in this, but I think what I would like is to get a reassurance that you're going to directly target the inner city residents associations for consideration of this policy and invite them to make submissions, because I think that is the mechanism for allowing those broader issues to be included within the policy. I also see standard timeframes applying to parking meters in an area of the central city which has virtually no parking on the weekends. So the metered parking stays empty until 6 p.m, which is when the charges stop. And even after the charges stop, there isn't much on-street parking there because there's available on-street parking along Cranmer Square. But that's not available during weekdays, which means because from 5:30 in the morning, it's taken by people who work in the inner city, tradies, I guess, and potentially hospital workers there. So given that, there's just nowhere for tradies to park except for metered parks. So, I don't know what the answer is, but...
So certainly in response to your first question, the Central City residents groups have been engaged as part of the development of the policy. So they're one of the targeted groups we recognise. It's an important stakeholder group. So we've had a workshop with them and talked through what we're trying to achieve with the parking policy. So certainly their feedback has been incorporated into where we are at the moment. And they will be notified if this goes out to consultation in January. Then they will be notified of that and encouraged to submit. With regards to not having spaces available for visitors and tradespeople, this is part of the framework of prioritisation, which those would come under the short stay. So if having, whether it's time restrictions or if the time restrictions still don't manage demand down by metering, that will free up the space from whether it's commuters or longer stay parkers, so that there are spaces available close to residences, and that's the idea of the 85% occupancy. We want space to be well utilised, but we don't want it to be 100% utilised, because then no one can get a park where the next person can't get a car park. So that's the point of the framework, in order to manage demand down, so that the people that really need it, where they need it, there are spaces available.
But that's across a week. There is a complete difference on the weekend to the week.
So the parking policy does allow for differentials. Obviously what you're pointing out is that we've got, I guess, some restrictions in place that aren't differentiated, and you're raising a question, and the policy would allow us to respond to that as to whether that differential is appropriate in some, would be appropriate to have in some areas. So the policy definitely allows for that differential across days and times of the week.
Except the policy should be explicit in terms of regarding the 85% occupancy to be broken down to the different parts of the week, rather than just a blanket across the week.
Yeah, so with regards to the 85% occupancy, instead of considering that as a space being occupied 85% of the time, if we think about it as if there's 10 spaces, we want 8 or 9 of them to be occupied at any one time. So it's not 85% of the time, it's 85% of the spaces at any point in time.
The goal is the actual goal of 85% occupancy is aimed at peak times. So it's to manage peak demand when it would actually be 100% if it wasn't there. It's certainly not intended to be in place, put restrictions in place at non-peak times that discourage anybody from parking there. That's not the intention of it. We can review the wording.
But that's a change from the current situation, because obviously the current situation allows for that to happen.
My reading of this policy is it's actually the framework that will actually fix the issue around Armour Street, Cranmer Square, where you've got one area that's 100% parked during the day, and then you've got metered car parking where there's absolutely no one parked. But I think this actually will create a framework that will actually allow that to be addressed. Could be a good conversation with your local councillor.
Where is he?
I've seen everyone's hand, so I've
Yep.
got a list. Is that your?
Yep.
Excellent. James Goff.
Thanks, Mike. Just a couple of questions from me. Well, when the paper quotes, I think it's on page 27, that there are 35,000 car parks in the central city, is that genuinely available car parks for the public, or does it include permanently leased spaces that the public can't access?
So that's total car parks, which includes
Okay.
on-street, off-street, public and private.
Okay.
And those private car parks include a mix of, for example, Pack and Save in South City. They're for customer parking, so there's a mixture in there, and we've got that breakdown at a high level, and it's a continuous improvement process.
I guess, okay, that's helpful. Following on from that, do you have the figures then? Because I think there's a bit of a difference between, the likes of the Pack and Save or Countdown car parks versus Lane Neves car parks, or something like that. Do you have any of those figures just for us to get a feel of that distinction?
So, as part of previous presentations, we've broken that down into the publicly available and private. We've got a continuous improvement program to break that down. I'm sure you can appreciate that, particularly with gravel lots and unmarked car parks, actually defining the number of car parking spaces at any individual point in time is very difficult. And depending on what kinds of vehicles are parking in those spaces, you can have 10 or 20% difference in the numbers of car parks. So we're working on that at the moment, and it's a continuous ongoing monitoring framework we've got for that.
But
Yes.
just to return to your question, we don't have the breakdown, for example, for Pack and Save versus a private business that has basement parking. But what Darren has been working on with some of our other colleagues is trying to make sure we can spatially map car parks. So where I guess we're continuously looking at how we can get more granular data about what the parks are and where they are and how to classify them.
Okay, that's helpful. I suppose that sort of answers my question, my next one, which was going to be, is it possible through the consultation to be able to differentiate those? But I appreciate it's challenging. Is there any way that it could sort of be referenced, or an attempt could be made to perhaps even provide a flavour of what that breakdown is, or would it just be too difficult?
It's at the moment we have a large amount of parking information available on our website with regards to metered parking and restricted parking. Then it's possible, but depending on what the breakdown needs to look like, we're working on this data for internal purposes so that we have a good understanding of the different kinds of car parks and whether at any point in time, because obviously it does change from day to day, week to week, but certainly we can make as much of that publicly available as possible, certainly.
That would be great. Certainly if an effort could be made to inform that consultation, I think that would be useful. Next question is, in the prioritisation schedule, I think it's policy 1 on page 34, does taxi and special vehicle parking allow for ride-sharing vehicles such as Uber?
So could you repeat the question?
In the prioritisation schedule, which is policy 1 on page 34, does taxi and special vehicle parking allow for ride-sharing vehicles such as Uber?
We have a specific ride-share policy, so they are not the same thing as what we're looking at with taxi and special passenger vehicle parking, because you're looking more at Uber there. We do have a policy later which talks about basically if you're looking at allocating parking for something that we've got a specific policy on, you should be using that policy, and we do have a car share policy.
Okay, but we've also got like cycle policies and everything like that. Would it not make sense to have ride sharing, given that it's probably, I don't know the stats, but dare I say, could even be more popular than taxis nowadays, actually like given a heading in the prioritisation schedule, because right now they're not even mentioned.
We can certainly
I assume that taxi would have also included ride sharing, so I'm just a little bit concerned that it doesn't.
Aren't they different things?
You're talking about Uber,
Well,
right? Uber, aren't you? Pretty much. Which
Well,
is,
other companies other than Uber, but yeah, you know what I mean.
but not,
I mean,
not like the car share where you actually have a car parked on the road, which I think
I mean
like a taxi.
like when we say short-term accommodation, we say Airbnb, but there are other platforms. So I mean Uber and the like.
Yeah.
So I think there's two different types of restriction here with regards to time restrictions. So whether P5s, P10s for drop-offs, pickups of any kind of vehicle, and then there's the vehicle restriction itself, which could be a commercial vehicle for loading on like a truck, or it could be a taxi or an Uber. So it's whether having a time restricted, so a P5 or P10, would service that need appropriately, or whether we need to restrict it down to a particular type of vehicle. So we're differentiating an Uber from someone picking up their mother from the shops, for example.
Yes, I guess where I'm going with it is, you know, in the classifications for commercial central city and commercial central city and mixed use, priority 7 is the taxis, and then there's no mention of Uber and the like, but they are essentially taxis. I guess I'm just asking, I don't want taxi rank.
They're meant to be captured by that special passenger vehicle, but we can clarify that. Sorry, I thought you were talking about car share when you park on a street, I guess permanently.
No, yeah. And I think Mike helped me with that just to clarify that I was meaning Ubers and those sort of things. No, that's great. So I found that a little bit unclear then. So if you would be able to clarify that, I think that would be helpful. And the only other one is I've heard mixed messages around this, and I don't know if you can help me, but I'll give it a try. Historically, have central city development contributions that were charged in the past, did we ever levy for publicly available car parking?
I'm sorry, I don't have
So we'd have to
that
look into
data.
that.
We can get back to you.
Okay. Yeah, if you could, that would just be helpful. I just want to know where that might leave us if car parking bills that might have been paid for via development contributions, if those numbers then aren't replaced, and just how we navigate that. So if you would be able to, that would be great. I think that's enough, Mr. Chair. I've taken up enough time, so thank you.
Thanks, James. Anne.
You you said something about this incorporates the genuine cost of parking. It would be interesting to know, do you know how much a car park in Hereford Street actually costs the city in terms of holding that space, or is that something that you could find out for us? I think it would be interesting to know.
So there's a broad range of data with regards to the land value, which obviously changes over time, and then the construction value. But certainly numbers that we've been quoted coming up in discussion for a parking building, it's around $70,000 to provide a car parking space, which is consistent with international data on parking provision. Also, so $70,000 to produce a space. So if you had a piece of real estate which is worth $70,000, you can kind of equate that back to what you would want to receive in annual rent or of the space. But this is shifting across to parking and vehicle storage as a use of land rather than part of the transport network.
Okay.
You asked about on-street parking, and I guess one of our measures for that is if you've got, if you look at the revenue from, we have not a huge number of metered car parks, I think it's about 1,300 spaces, and you can look at the revenue to determine essentially the value that people are placing on the space in terms of choosing to park there. So I guess you can have different measures for what the exact value of that space is. Darren's given you the figure for the park in a public car parking building, private car parking building, but there's also that idea that you could also look at metered revenue, and particularly once you're right in the central city, that would be more expensive. I think you've got some.
Yeah, so we have the, not to hand, but we have the numbers for the revenue that each metre generates, which is a good signal of the value that people place on that space.
Okay. So I guess the question is, does what people give in terms of pay for that, does it cover the costs that the city actually incurs because of that space?
It's very difficult to measure the cost because it's not just the value of the real estate. There's safety costs, there's congestion costs, there's health and emissions, etc. So there's lots of international literature on that, but breaking it down to an individual space, it's highly variable.
Thank you. And just one other question in terms of this policy doesn't apply to park and ride, or car sharing, where would we find, is there a policy that the council has about those two things, park and ride and also car sharing?
We do have a policy on car sharing, so I think I think we mention other types of, modes or other types of vehicles. I can't remember which policy number it is, but it suggests we've got an electric vehicle policy and we've got a car share policy. So, as I mentioned before, where a policy like that is in place, it's meant to be supplementary to this parking policy, so it's not excluded by it. We just haven't replicated the policy in the parking policy.
And with regards to park and ride, the coverage of this is within the 4 avenues, so there would be no park and rides within the 4 avenues.
Park and rides will affect how many cars come into the central city. So that's the whole idea of having people not bringing their cars in will affect the parking and all sorts of things. So it sort of seems like it's connected. So, yeah.
So, and there's...
It's mentioned in the suburban parking policy in the same kind of section where we refer to the car share policy here. This suburban parking policy refers to park and ride.
Right, okay. So that's where I find it.
You would find it, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Andrew.
Thank you. Relating to policy 7 on page 41, I think probably because the title of this section seems a little bit misleading compared to the content. There's been some suggestion that this means that we're going to exit providing off-street parking, whereas when you read the text, it actually reiterates our existing commitments. And this policy really relates to council not generally providing additional off-street parking. So first of all, just to confirm that my reading of it is the case, and to make a suggestion that we might change the wording of the title to include that word additional, because otherwise I think in consultation we may get a reaction that is unjustified because of the title versus the wording. So what we're really doing here is committing, as I understand it, to continuing to provide the off-street parking that we do, but we are setting a policy direction that we wouldn't generally provide additional off-street parking, although we're not ruling that out completely. We were saying that there are those matters at the bottom that we would consider as alternatives to doing that before, by exception, providing additional off-street parking. So if my reading of that is correct, which I guess is the question, can I suggest that we add the word additional to the title there?
So I can confirm your reading is correct. We've left some discretion in there because legally we need to. We can't bind the council to never consider that, but it's meant to send a strong signal that apart from what we've already constructed and the existing commitments we have, we're not looking to provide additional off-street parking, as you say. So that's correct, and yes, we can amend the heading.
I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yanni.
Thank you. So just a question on policy 7. I see that you state that council needs to encourage the uptake of active and public transport, and then you go on to say, and avoid undermining the commercial feasibility of permanent parking provision by the market. And you say that we also need to provide certainty for commercial providers and potential investors in off-street parking. I'm just wondering, like, what analysis you've done of the impact of council leaving it to the private sector in terms of the social impact on people in terms of car parking charges and car parking penalties.
Well, we wouldn't be completely leaving it to the private sector because we do actually have 2 buildings at the moment, and probably the bigger issue for those major car parking buildings is the fact that we've got a lot of cheap surface car parking which offers early bird rate to commuters. So we spoke to those car parking building providers as part of our targeted engagement. And in terms of should we wish to encourage demand to be met through, I guess, these high amenity buildings, it's going to be difficult if council is enabling, I guess, this idea of very cheap surface car parking, which, as we all know, is creating some issues. So I guess that you have to acknowledge that trade-off.
But sorry, I guess at a high level, we've allowed a whole bunch of unconsented, I don't know if they're illegal or not approved, car parking for the private sector to make lots of money off, and we're now saying that we don't believe we should provide public car parking version off-street because we want to provide benefit to the private sector. But do we have any sort of assessment of what happens when council doesn't provide off-street public car parking in terms of what it means in terms of pricing, and also what we've seen with a number of quite high-profile cases in the media where people, they overstay a minute and they get a $100 or a $65 fine, which seems incredibly unfair and unreasonable. So I'm just concerned that in the section in Policy 7, you haven't provided any balance as to the benefits of council providing off-street car parking compared to the private sector, and I'm wondering why not?
So I guess the first thing with regards to provision of off-street parking is it's very, very expensive to provide. So the figures quoted around $70,000 per space to provide a car parking space. We know from the national resources on parking management that case studies, for example, in Hastings, where they went out to consultation regarding whether council should be subsidising parking or whether it should be user pays, and the vast majority of people through that consultation process came back saying it should be a user pay system. So in order to enable a user pay system, that's when the market can come into play. As Lorraine pointed out, we've got the Litchfield Street and the Art Gallery car parks as pressure valves. We have on-street parking as pressure valves, and there's also this central city policy. We also have a large number of other travel options available to people coming into the central city. With regards to the social impact, there's a large number of other choices people can make, acknowledging that from a social equity perspective, the most socially deprived households have lower access to vehicles. So by subsidising vehicle travel, we're actually disadvantaging the most socially deprived people of Christchurch.
Yeah, so you don't see any benefit in council providing off-street public car parking, and you don't see any concern or risk with the private sector being
I
providing
think this
it.
is about additional car parking. So one thing this policy says is it outlines what our existing off-street parking is. So it hasn't suggested, for example, that council doesn't continue to offer those facilities. And Darren mentioned that those things we consider do work as a pressure valve. So I guess providing some balance between having, wholly owned private sector parking and having some council owned parking.
So have you seen, I know I put this question through, quite a wee while ago, what happened in Wellington in terms of things like the private sector being anti-competitive and the Commerce Commission having to get involved?
And certainly if there was any anti-competitive behaviour, that could be referred to the Commerce Commission.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem very balanced in that policy around.
I think they've answered the question. Obviously, this is going to go for consultation, so I'm sure it will get fed in if that view is shared.
Okay, so can I just ask then, in terms of the central city parking plan that we have, is there an update report back on that? Is there, because I know this policy is replacing it, but there doesn't seem to be, I couldn't find where we actually go through what we said we would do in that parking plan policy, what we've achieved, what we haven't achieved and why, and then what's kind of been superseded. So is there kind of like a report back on our existing policy to show what we said we'd do, whether we've delivered or not, and then why the changes are necessary?
So we don't have a specific report, but there's a large part of that was with regards to earthquake recovery and the short-term provision of gravel lots, which has obviously been extended. So that's been a significant part of providing certainty that people would be able to access the central city by car in the short term. So no, we don't have a specific paper on all of the 2015 parking plan, but if that's something that would be required, that's something
I just
we can
thought
look into.
it's quite good to have an action list of things that we'll do when we adopt policies or strategies, and I just wonder whether we could get, just some sense of, to explain to the community in terms of the consultation process, the things that we've done, the things that we haven't. Because what comes through in 2015, there's actually a number of similar things that you've got. They've just been carried over to the new policy, variable charging, etc. But there's also things like, making parking information available, which I know we've done a lot of work on. So, yeah, I think it would be quite useful for people to see what's being done and what's still outstanding and how this new policy will be changed as a result. The only other thing I was going to get into, I know you've you've kind of said that it's more operational, but there is kind of discussion in here about the value of space and using technology around parking. So I just don't quite know when we have a discussion about the new ways of technology and how we use that for variable pricing in terms of demand, but also I guess the issue of the cost of technology in terms of parking. So, you know, is there anything that we are considering that would mean that we would have greater control over the value of space? Because one of the things that you put in here, value of space may be measured from metre revenue, but actually if these private companies that we're contracting with are making a huge fortune from it, why wouldn't we want that to come either back to the city or reduce that cost?
And that would be something from a procurement policy for the providers we use, so it's not something that we would cover in this policy.
Right, so things like data from parking and privacy and I guess who gets the benefit of it, have we got any policies or protocols around that?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
So if you read the policy 2, look at the value of space and the opportunity for variable restrictions. Really what I'm trying to understand is what are we doing to ensure that, you know, we can look at that in terms of technology, and how do we have a framework for assessing how that technology is used in terms of privacy and cost?
I just think that would be part of our operational framework and our procurement approach.
Right.
Thanks, Yanni. Mel? Jimmy?
On page 18, 6.2, particularly mentioned you try to achieve the goal in the central city. The high peak time period, they have 85% occupy the street. But my understanding, on street is 6,700 parking places. And also the council control public off-street car parks is 10,000. So total is about the 16,701. So how to handle or control the rest of the 18,000 off-street parking places, private one?
Yes, so saying this parking policy does not cover the those privately provided parking spaces, which might be customer car parks or visitor car parks, employee car parks. There's very little we can do about, particularly given that we've had no minimum parking requirements in the central city pretty much since the earthquakes. If a private business owner or developer chooses to provide parking for their customers,
Yes.
That's something they're free to do. If they're full all the time, that's something that they consider, but it's that's not covered by this policy. I guess the key part is with regards to the on-street parking, encouraging visitors into the central city. We want to make sure that if someone wants a space close to where they want to be, that we have the appropriate restrictions or pricing in place so that there are spaces available where they want to.
Yes.
Because if a space is full, then everyone else is excluded from it.
Some businesses are increasingly looking at shared parking models. So the casino is one business that does that, where they actually share the space with other businesses during the day.
Yes.
While we can't control that, the policy does note that we could have potential role in facilitating that kind of, I guess, shared behaviour. When we do that, it doesn't specify, but it just acknowledges we could potentially have a role in that.
And Victoria Street's a good example of that, where you have some businesses during the day will have their employee car parking, and then then those car parks are closed off in the evening, where you have people coming in for hospitality. So there are opportunities there to join businesses together, so that the peak demands arrive at different times. So we can have an overall lower supply of parking, but still provide the same value and opportunity for the different user groups throughout the day and throughout the week.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, last question. So sorry. Second, the kind of goal is support the greenhouse gas emission reduction target. I'm not sure what kind of support, what kind of tech action can achieve this one, particularly whether it's
Tim asked that question
aligned.
right at the very start.
Yeah.
Tim's already asked that question right at the very start about the greenhouse gases.
Okay.
Tim?
Yeah, sorry, just following on from your comment with regards to the casino, that seems a kind of a sensible thing to do, the sharing the car park with the community. Why would we want to kind of, you're saying that we would want to try and encourage others to do that, which seems the logical thing, rather than kind of control it if it's happening organically?
We couldn't control it. So the parking policy just sets out some of our roles. So obviously we own car parks. We're involved in regulation of them and compliance and monitoring of our on-street car parks. And then it just notes that potentially we might have a facilitation role. Doesn't suggest we should be controlling them, but it might be that there was something positive we could do to, I guess, enable or encourage smart sharing car parks.
Okay.
But definitely not to control.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Page 37, just give me, what's happening? I love technology. Sorry, give me 2 seconds. Mobility, I guess we just, in the area that we've got in, because with Te Pai, we actually mentioned somewhere with regards to working with the government with regards to the metro sports, all those things, and Te Pai is one. And in that area between Gloucester and Armour on Colombo, we've got the arts precinct, so that's going to have shortly or one day have the court theatre there, etc. But we do seem to have a lack of disability parkings in that area at the moment. So what do we look at putting more in whilst we wait for the car park building to be built, the proposed or the talked about one in the area, or what's the process there? Because pardon? Well, at the moment, look what we looked at this morning with regards to Te Pai, we've got one on Colombo Street. Well, there's quite a few.
So the policy certainly enables that.
Yep.
And with regards to with limited street space, it's balancing off the demand for mobility parks. Also recognising that when you look at the demand and the alternatives available, having another mobility park 3 blocks away obviously isn't a lot of use. So certainly it's something we look at with the demand, the alternatives available, and what the framework allows is mobility parks is very close to the top of that framework with regards to priority. That doesn't mean that we have mobility parks everywhere, but it demonstrates council's commitment to providing access to mobility impaired of an appropriate standard where there is demand for it, which might vary over time. And you mentioned the allowing for changes, so it could be that if there was a demand for it in the short term, it could then be changed as alternatives become available.
So when we build new central city streets, which we're doing with Hereford Street, etc., are there provisions in that design? So in the future, if we say, well, actually we need another disability or 2 disabilities in this area, that the design's already there so all we have to do is just put the signs in?
That's not a question I can answer around the detailed design of that.
Okay, thank you. It's under another policy, I'll take it.
I'm happy to move this. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Templeton. All right, all those in favour? Oh. Yanni?
Just want to bring council's attention to policy 10, support and adopt advances in parking management technology. Technologies make parking more customer friendly, reduce operating costs, enhance data collection and monitoring, and it just has a blanket statement that will support and adopt advances in parking management technology where possible. And yet, despite this being a policy, we've got very little detail about what's actually going to be done in that regard. But what we do know is that things like access to data has a huge benefit to some. We've seen cases in other parts of New Zealand where parking apps are directly linked to enforcement, which mean that people have had, I think, unfairly being able to be targeted without knowing where that data is going. So, I think we do need to actually think much more clearly about what the implications are of using these technologies and what the public benefit to us and to our citizens is versus to the private operators. I'm really concerned that Policy 7 that we're adopting doesn't have fair balance in terms of the private sector. I note that Wilson's car parking has made, in 12 months to the end of June 2018, had a combined revenue of Hong Kong 85.644 billion, which is $16.26 billion of revenue coming in for the off-street and car parking and all the other things that they do. And in New Zealand, Kiwi Motors paid 121 million to parking in terms of fines to Wilson parking. So, and for parking revenue. So, you know, the idea that we would somehow leave it to the private sector and that is a fair approach, I fundamentally disagree with. There's numerous examples of where residents of our city are being charged excessively and not reasonably for the breaches of parking in private sector. I'd much rather see council providing off-street car parking. I think the idea that we look to limit the number of on-street parking to get better amenity is important, but we should balance that out by providing off-street parking. Clearly it generates revenue, and I think we should continue to go down that line. So I'm not going to support this policy. I don't believe that we have enough information for some of the things that are being put in here, and I'd much rather see us take a much more balanced approach to the consideration of the impact on our citizens of just leaving it to the private sector. I don't believe it should be our role to benefit the private sector. It should be our role to look after the people in this city.
Tim.
Thank you. Look, I will support this today because it is merely going out to approve for going out for public consultation through the hearings panel. So I think that's going to be a really good thing. I do hope the public take on board that it is happening and they do make their voice heard. As an organisation, and I really thank you guys, it's kind of like one of those things that you don't really want to do but needs to be done, so thank you for that, because everyone has an opinion about parking without question, and including myself. But I do think our policies and we need to get an understanding of how our policies link and to talk with those different groups of staff who are driving those policies in the same room, because at the moment, for me personally, I do think there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect with the charge on, or the going forward with regards to the policies on vacant spaces, how that links into off-street parking and how that will affect the on-street parking and other parking, and also just what you mentioned with regards to the procurement policy, which affects this. So there are a number of things that are going around affecting this policy, which I would like a better understanding of how other policies affect this, and I think it would actually be good to understand other staff's understanding of how these affect each other. So I will be supporting this today, as I said, but only because it's going out for to a hearing.
Leanne.
Yeah, I wasn't going to speak. I'm very supportive of this going out. It is a draft. I congratulate staff on talking to all the relevant groups in order to get their feedback into it before it goes out for consultation, and I think it's been improved for that. And it's linking to the suburban parking policy is just, I think, quite important in terms of where we're going as a city. So I'm very supportive of it going out for consultation. But I'm afraid that I have to respond. Sometimes councillors inadvertently repeat nonsense that they read somewhere on the internet, and somehow that becomes part of a narrative. And I mean, I've seen it happen in so many other places. It's influenced the American elections, for goodness sake, with conspiracy theories and various other things that apply from time to time. Wilson's car parking and any private company does not have the power to fine. There is no such thing. Only the police, only our road traffic controlling, controlling authorities, the council has the power to fine. So there are very clear powers that sit within that. They have developed a regime around an alleged breach of contract. We all know around contract law about the imposition of contracts when people don't realise they're entering into one when they park on private parking land. So I think it's unfortunate to repeat the nonsense, because it does provide them with a ready source of income. I know many people who have challenged the ability to so-called impose a significant breach of contract clause that nobody knew that they were signing up to when they entered into the car park. I think it is imperative that we get that joined-up approach that Councillor Scandrett talked about, because the next policy the next paper that we're going to look at is very much integrated into the whole, and I think that the staff themselves have sought to find a balance between those who choose to live in our residential neighbourhoods in the inner city and those who do business there. So I thank you very much for the work that you've done. You've got some work cut out for you ahead, but I will be supporting the policy going out for consultation with the people of Christchurch. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. I also support this going out for consultation. This is a draft for consultation, and I certainly look forward to hearing what the people of Christchurch have got to say about it. I'll focus on Policy 7, which was also the focus of my questions. And, you know, I would be concerned if what we were intending doing was exiting provision of off-street parking as a council. I think council has a role in providing off-street parking. But I also think the private sector has a role in providing off-street parking, particularly where that supports commercial development, where there is a requirement or a benefit to having parking attached or supporting those developments. Council does have a role in providing off-street parking, and I see this document as a commitment to continue doing so through our existing buildings at Litchfield Street and the Gallery. And also a sensible approach to consideration of whether council would be the right provider should there be a need to provide additional off-street parking. This document really is about finding the balance. It's about finding the balance between resident parking and casual parking. It's about finding the balance between on-street and off-street. It's also about finding the balance between council-provided off-street parking, which means that can be provided at a reasonable price to support community activity, and private market provision of off-street parking for reasons that I've already outlined. So I support where we're at. I welcome the change to the title of Policy 7 that was suggested as a result of my question, and I think that will confirm that Council absolutely intends to play a role in providing off-street parking. It's the provision of additional off-street parking where this policy would come into play.
Sarah.
Kia ora. I think that this is really straightforward. It's a draft for consultation, and we've had a lot of opportunities already, and we've had this presented in workshops. We've had a lot of opportunities, both of those workshops and by email, to ask questions and give input, and staff have addressed a great number of those things that we've discussed in the past for this draft, and so thank you so much for that work. It's been really good to see this come through. Our role is absolutely to look after the people of the city by doing what's in this policy. So by having smart apps and those kind of things that we've already seen examples of, are ways that we can ensure that those who need a mobility park can find a vacant mobility park when they need it. And there's the technology available, and if we were able to make sure we could do that kind of thing, that would help the people of our city who need to find that kind of park. There are apps and systems available where you can find parks, and we can adjust prices to make sure that vacancy rates are suitable so that people can find a park where and when they need one. This will also improve amenity in the city, which is good for the city itself, good for businesses, good for the people, and importantly for me, this will help us start in this space to address our emissions and climate change. Making parking for commuters or for shoppers as easy as possible will encourage emissions to rise. What we need to do is make sure that those who are able to have a really good way of busing, biking, walking into town, parking out further, carpooling, all of those kind of things, which lowers the demand for parking in our central city. We know that if we don't do that, our emissions will continue to rise. The Litchfield Street car parking building cost us $31 million and holds 800 cars. If we're expecting 60,000 people working in our CBD, we simply do not have the money or the land available to build enough car parks for that. We need to encourage other modes, and parking is a way to do that. Thank you.
Right, I'll close the debate if there's nobody else. I think this is actually a really good policy, and we've landed on a good place. So I also thank the staff who have worked on this, and actually colleagues around the table have provided guidance along the way as well. I think Councillor Johansson talked about about adopting it. We're not adopting it today. This is going out for consultation with the public. We did see through the suburban car parking policy that actually there was a number of changes made through that process. And the guts of it, really talking about 7,000, nearly 7,000 on-street car parks that the council operate and maintain. A huge majority of them actually free, but it's really trying to balance competing uses for those car parks, whether it's for a bus, mobility, short stay taxi, loading zones, commuter. And I think when you look at what we're currently going out with for consultation, number one is safety, their movement and amenity, and then we're getting down to mobility parking. So we're really getting the right order of actually where we need to prioritise and truly actually look after the people of Christchurch. We are seeing some really good outcomes in the city, and it's really important that we actually maintain that by getting this framework in place so we can make consistent decisions around our car parking to make sure that we get the occupancy we need. I'd also like to touch on the fact that one of the strategic goals that we have is around climate change, and actually if we do this right, we will encourage people to come in other forms of transport, like buses. It doesn't work if you actually allow all your car parks to be filled up by people that are going to commute into town and leave their cars in that car park for 8 hours of a day. Hence, when you look at the hierarchy, commuter car parking is right at the very bottom. It's important though that we get the balance right, and I think this framework allows that to happen. So it's going to be really good to actually put this out to the public and hear from the public, and we'll obviously have this debate again when it comes back. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried.